Peace. It is I, the Energy Master Allah, and this is Decoding the Matrix Part 2. I'm doing these kind of impromptu freestyle workshop type joints. If you haven't seen Part 1 of the workshop, I suggest you watch that first because I'm building on top of some of those things. If you didn't see the intro video, I did one on Facebook. The live was called Dochi and the Matrix, and there was some background information like an introduction, but make sure you check those out. Also, make sure you like, share, comment, subscribe, all that on the YouTube. It's just search for Energy Master. Look for the I ain't gonna call him a monkey, I'm gonna say the Vanara. Look for the Hanuman with the green background. All right, that's me. Okay. And then speaking of which, I got Son Goku on the shirt right here from Dragon Ball. He's also based on a similar legend. So a lot of people, they believe that Hanuman and Son Goku, the Monkey King, aka Sun Wukong, come from similar roots. It comes from a long tradition, and somewhere along the way they started making these people monkeys. But you know how that goes. But anyway, so where we left off last time on Dragon Ball Z, we left off last time talking about these connections between these microscopic creatures called technically little plant things called diatoms that make these beautiful geometric shells, and how the underlying thing behind that ended up, so we turned that into all sorts of other things. And we were talking about the structure of an atom, how that math corresponded to the shells of that atom. I see you, Alafia. Babalawo, I see you. Okay, peace. And so we were talking about that, and so that science of how the electron shells are formed in an atom, that carries over to the means by which each of the realms, so you hear them talk about the domes and firmaments, all of that good stuff. Regardless of what you believe in, it's a central concept that relates to using a certain mathematical pattern to organize frequencies, so that you're able to experience one thing as being separate from other things. But the thing to remember with membranes is that, just like the membrane that's around a cell, yes, it holds things in, and yes, it can keep things out, but it's also got a system that determines what can get in and what can get out. And so that's where that permission etymology of the word love is very important. And when you're talking about permittivity in when you're talking about electricity, or you're talking about a vacuum, you're basically talking about the resistance of that space or that substance to electric fields. Because if an electric field is introduced, it can do a number of things that we may or may not get into. But that's the perfect segue into what we're talking about today. So just like last time, I'm going to go ahead. I got a whiteboard prepared for this one. We'll hopefully be able to use just that one whiteboard in order to be able to get through this part. Anything else, it would be saved for the next one. And let's get into it. All right, about to switch this camera, of course. Oh, I just lost my whiteboard. It just slid down. These are all the things you can look forward to when we do workshops live. That's how you know it's real. It's not that fake stuff. We don't do fake. We don't do fake like them other folks. They not like us. It's all about that real in here. Okay, so we were talking about last time. We were talking about this guy Thales of Miletus, who may or may not have existed at the very least. Now, something to mention about, especially like Greek and Roman history, there is a point, of course, where a lot of it, like you can't tell the difference between what's supposed to be mythology, what's supposed to be history. Why anybody thinks that any culture does things differently is beyond me, because even with the Bible, some things may or may not be historical, but when you're taking into account the fact that what we ended up with is a collection of writings and books that were created separately from each other and then brought together into one body of work, you basically get this thing that happens where you have both mythology and historical situations interacting with each other. And whereas you would think that would cause a problem, it actually helps with a lot of things, because when you have elements that are removed from the a specific context, you can see how that general type of energy or that general type of system can apply in a number of situations, regardless of whether it's fact or fiction. Because, you know, emotions are emotions. Like, you don't have to have a real character. I can have a cartoon rabbit, but if I give that cartoon rabbit convincing emotional, you know, if I write it real well and I have a good actor that's presented that emotion, you're able to suspend your belief and believe that that rabbit is sad. It's like you're not so hung up on the fact that it's a cartoon rabbit. Likewise, you can have people that are real flesh and blood who have fake emotions, you know, so that goes to show you right there that the underlying principles behind these energies are independent of whether you believe they are real or whether they are fake. And that's something that's going to come into play in a minute when we talk about real numbers versus imaginary numbers, but that's a little ways off. So this guy Thales of Miletus, just to remind you, born in 624 BC, best known for this eclipse that he predicted in 585 BC. And this is considered the first event that is considered to be confirmed, recorded, so on and so forth. So anything before 585 BC is mostly considered guessing by the academia. 585 is also considered the year that science was birthed. Thales of Miletus is credited with discovering electromagnetic fields and electrostatic. If you know anything about the Supreme Wisdom lessons, the 120 lessons, then you know that when they get to talking about Jacob and the story of how devil was made and all of that, that magnetism plays a big role in that. He was playing with magnets. Peace, Ninth Gutters in the building. They were playing about magnets. So that's one of those details that a lot of people just kind of leave off or just kind of relegate to being just metaphor or whatever, but it's very important, especially given what I told you in the last video about these different things that are associated with Thales. All right, so Thales, his name, the etymology of it, Thales comes from to bloom, which is also the etymology of the word blood. So the logic behind it is that it's also associated with flow. The idea of when you open a vein, blood gushes out. So it's like the blooming of a flower is a metaphor for that. And that association with flow is important because flow is also where we get the words fly as well as flood. So we already talked about how that process of those diatoms being blown all the way from Africa to the East Coast, to the Atlantic coast of the United States, these various rivers, South America, all of that, and how that imitates, if not being the source of the myths or whatever accounts regarding God blowing air into the dust and then Adam being made. And so likewise, it looks like this is also connected to some of the flood stories that we get. So just keep that in the back of your mind, because flow is very important. So that same thing I was talking about with imaginary versus real numbers, it has to do with flow as well. So we'll fill in that blank in a minute. So blooming of the granary. So I made it. So a granary is a storage facility for grains. Now, the specific etymology of the word Miletus. Miletus is the name of a place, but then where its name comes from, it can mean like a honey pot. It can mean a storage facility. There's other roots that connected to loved, and I don't know if I mentioned it in the last video, but the word loved, in addition to having to do with permission and permittivity, it also has the element of desire, and the word desire actually comes from the stars. And so this is why I made a secondary etymology of this name, Thales of Miletus, blood of the stars. And when we're talking about a star, we're not just talking about the balls of whatever they tell you it is up in the sky, but it's a concept of a toroidal field. So what is a toroidal field? Easy explanation is the shape of a donut. And the point of it is, in this particular type of toroidal field, as opposed to just simply having a hole in the middle, we're talking about where you have this shape. It meets at a pinch point in the middle, like one point, and then it spreads back out. So you can look at that like how you see those pictures of magnetic fields around the planet, where they come back together in the core and they spread out over the face of this thing. So just about everything in the universe basically functions on this. And essentially what you're seeing when you have a toroidal field is that you're having the feminine aspect and the masculine aspect come together. So you've got something that is the source, you could say, and then you have something that is a manifestation of their source, a projection of their source. And when you unite those two things, you basically get an entire system. So positive and negative become the ends of a single magnet. So you got one thing called the magnet, but it has a positive end and a negative end, as opposed to two separate things. All right, so whenever those things get integrated, we get essentially what is the concept behind the star. Why is that? Because the stars, they are able to remain stable because they are balanced between the radiation they're sending out, like burning up and decaying and sending out light and particles like that. There's a balance between that and its gravitational resistance. So at the same time that it's pushing out light, that's the masculine, it's also pulling things in toward its center of mass. So that's that gravitation. And those two things can also be related to magnetism and electricity, respectively. So magnetism, you could think of that as being associated with radiation and repelling something. And then you can look at electricity as being like gravitation and pulling things toward a center, toward one point. Okay, so we got that under our belt. So now we're looking at this guy, Thales of Miletus, and the possibility that he's not just a person, but actually represents something. Likewise, you can do the same thing with the names of the people in the Bible, because every single one of their names means something in Hebrew. And if you look at what the names mean in Hebrew, you can see what function they serve as a character in their story. So why would it be coincidence that the people, their name just happens to do something with how their story played out? You know, like it wasn't just like Frank was over here and then he ended up having to go on an adventure and slay a dragon and da 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 da. It was this person's name is going to have to do with the same story that's happening. Their name is part of their story. So that shows you that they're characters. That does not mean that it rules out something being historical. It's just, it goes to show what happens when people walk the path that was carved for them. So if nothing else, take that away for it. It doesn't matter whether it's myth or reality. If a person is walking the path that's carved out for them, it will be some synonymy and some resonance between their name and their journey. There's nothing arbitrary about that. In fact, since we had Babalawo in here, with Ifa, when you look at the Odu Ifa, so you got this book with these which is can basically, like, to me and just what I've seen and researched, like the Protestant Bible, like, pretty much got this whole idea from the structure of Odu Ifa, because it basically, just like I described, you've got um these, what will I call them? Because they are beings, they are ancestors, but even more than that, they are specific potentialities. So when you descend from one of these particular heads, that means that those similar set of potentialities and probabilities are acting on your life as well. And so by reading, by having readings like that, Ifa readings, that gives you an idea of which energies are acting on you and which actions that you need to take in order to be able to, kind of walk that path and, be able to have a favorable journey through it. So all of these, you'll find that everything I'm describing here today, it can be tied back to specific African traditions that are very much concentrated in West Africa and still connected to other portions of both North Africa and the East, like around the Horn and along the Nile and things of that nature. But these were cultures that were pretty much before who you see there. So you see them other folks that live there now. They're still technically our descendants, but then these are they're related to those of us who migrated out of the African continent, went up around the Levant. We mixed and blended and, did all sorts of things for some years and then came back down into Africa. And so those are the people that you see there now. So a lot of them are kind of removed from their history, so they don't know that they are actually descendants of the original sub-Saharan Africans, just like the people of West Africa are. But they went up north and got light skin, just like how they do here in America. So you know how that goes. All right. So moving right along. So Thales. So why is Thales and his thing that happened in 585 so important, especially in a conversation of this matrix? Because we've got to look at what a matrix is. So a matrix is a simulation, and a simulation is not necessarily a computer simulation. A perfect example from Baudrillard's Simulacra and Simulation book, which is partially an inspiration for the Matrix movies. He talks about how, imagine that you have a sacred site, like let's say like there's like Indian artifacts or something. It's a sacred site, and you don't want tourists coming and messing up the site, so you can preserve it. And so a little ways up the way, maybe a mile away, you create a replica of the site, exact replica of it, that they can come and they can mess with and experience, and so on and so forth. Now imagine that new site becomes so popular that the original site becomes overgrown with plants and all kind of stuff happens, and people forget about the original. So now they're treating the new one as if it was the original one or whatever. So that's what we're talking about, simulation. For those of you who study the lessons and deal with the knowledge of self and things of that nature, you can already hear in that explanation I just gave you of this same parallel of somebody or something similar coming along, and we forget who the original is. We forget what our original state is. We find out all these other ways that we can be and all these other shapes that we can take. But at the end of the day, if you want to solve the world's problems, you got to remember where we came from and what our original form is, so that we can trace our steps back and see what's necessary. Okay. So all of that brings, speaking about the original man, that brings me to the year 1933. Okay. So I'm going to tell you some of the stuff that you can't just pull up on the internet. So you can pull up versions of the supreme alphabet, versions of the supreme mathematics, You can pull up the supreme wisdom lessons that accompany those that are shared by both the 5% nation as well as the Nation of Islam. You can just pull that stuff up. Great. But what they're not going to do when you pull that up is explain to you the underlying meanings of things and the connections between things and so on and so forth. That's only something that you can do in, working with your enlightener as well as being in the cipher or whatever, building with older guys, like whatever, like you pick up that wisdom and you add it to your book of life. You add it to your collection of knowledge. Now, the year 1933, so the way the history goes, the way we understand it, is that in 1931, that is when Elijah Muhammad initially started receiving the lessons from the Honorable Fard Muhammad. So Fard Muhammad was considered to be by them Allah in the flesh. He was a very bright-skinned man, and that would become a source of contention later on with Allah, the founder of the 5%. But that's neither here nor there in this particular situation. Yeah, maybe a little bit, but not yet. Okay, and so by so you had the initial transmission, so you're getting like the 1 to 10 and stuff like that in 1931. Now, the next date that's given explicitly in the lessons is, I believe, it's February 20th, 1934, which is associated with the 1 to 40. So we got a definite date for when the 1 to 40 was transmitted. Now, where does 1933 come from? Okay, so it's understood that during that time period between 1931 in 1934 that Elijah Muhammad was continuously receiving those lessons from Fard Muhammad. Now, in the 1 to 14, the 14th degree, it specifically addresses Fard Muhammad as is it WD Fard or WD Muhammad, WF Muhammad, I believe is how they address it. And the reason that's important is because he didn't start signing his name that way until 1933. So that's the clue that, if you're in the know, tells you that that particular set of lessons is associated with 1933. Why is this super important? Because in the 1 to 14, it's giving you specific time periods that help you know when certain dates were on the Asiatic calendar. Now, when it's talking about when Musa, who is Moses, came and gave, he taught they had some devils that were set aside in the caves of Europe, and some 1,000 years later or so, Musa comes and he tries to civilize them by giving them, teaching them how to build homes for themselves, build a society for themselves. It's understood in those circles that those were the Greeks. That's part of their actual history. They talk about, originally being in caves and things of that nature. There's a lot of mythology that is sprinkled around that, as if the Greeks their knowledge just fell out of the sky, or they got their knowledge from the gods, which wasn't entirely wrong, because the gods that they received that information from was the original black people of planet Earth. Again, if you haven't seen my videos, the etymology of the word God itself, aside from the definitions that they would give you in these lessons and everything else, the actual accepted etymology of the word God is that which is invoked, which means to send voice or vibration in, and then also that which is found, referring to a foundry in which metals are shaped. So when you think about the idea of sound being sent into the body, such that that sound takes the shape of the body, that gives you access to understanding a large part of the way that we are able to program our own reality, program what's going on inside our body through things like chant, prayer, singing, all of those things that have been associated with black and brown and yellow peoples around the world. Okie dokie. So in that part about Musa, they specifically say that Musa as a prophet was predicted by the 23 scientists in the year 1 of the Asiatic calendar. 23 scientists can refer to the 23 chromosomes on one level, and it is also considered to be people who embodied that same kind of role. And I have even heard other stories outside of the context of Islam talking about 24 races of extraterrestrials or whatever they may be that were involved with seeding some of the other races on planet Earth. This is a very popular book that was even in the actual channeling sessions that were associated with that were frequented by Star Trek creator Gene Roddenberry. So a lot of the themes that came out of those readings made themselves into Star Trek, particularly as it relates to this concept of beings of all types being able to meet each other, learn how to interact with each other and get along and so on and so forth. So that's what was being pushed. And it's given the timing of it, it is very possible that much of what we do associate with extraterrestrials is not that these beings don't exist in some shape or form on some plane of existence. And I'll get into that in a little more detail a little bit later. But it does mean that the way that they presented it in Hollywood could have very easily been a way to weave these teachings and these lessons that I'm telling you about now into a medium that was acceptable for the time period and with the group of people that you had to deal with during that time period. So you couldn't just come right out and say things like, oh, the black man is God, whose proper name is Allah, blah, 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 blah. I mean, there was some folks that was doing it, but if you were going to get it to the masses in a way that could let them sit on it, digest it, investigate it, and so on and so forth, that's the way that that the other folks, that the allies that we had, that's how they were able to get it out to the masses in a way. And then you, as God or earth, wherever you are, you could point out those signs and those symbols in that show. Like when you watching that show with your homeboy, you can point out the signs inside of that episode that deal back with the lessons. All right. So it says that the year 1 of the Asiatic calendar was 15,019 years ago today, is exactly what it says in there. If you don't know whether that set of lessons came from 1931, 1933, or 1934, naturally 15,019 years ago is going to land you on a different year. And this is where the games begin. Okay, so if you calculate 15,019 years before 1933, if you just got a calculator and you could basically subtract 15,019 and then that negative number will give you the BC value. Well, we got a problem. So the value that you'll get is this 13,086 BC. Okay, and that is because you're including 0. If you know anything about the Roman calendar that we use, we don't have a year 0. It goes straight from 1 BC to 1 AD. They call it BCE now, and then they call it CE for AD, but then we just going to go with the old term. So BC is before Christ, and then AD is Anno Domini. So you could see how that would be a problem, and you could tell which cultures are affected by this problem, by this date over here, which I'll get into more detail about later. But the siege of Jerusalem, the famous siege of Jerusalem, that where the Temple of Solomon falls, is credited, like if you look this up, they'll say it was either in 587 BC or 586 BC. That means that even they aren't sure of which one of these years it happened in. And then I can assure you that part of the reason is that they had a similar calculation for the Asiatic calendar. And as a result of what happened with zero, they had 2 dates. Now, why does that become important? So if you've looked at my other videos, you see that it appears to be pretty common that they would encode messages based on the numerical values found in here and that correspond to letters. All right, so we've got a word written over here in the 13,087 version where you take 0 out, and the numbers correspond to their position in the alphabet. So a 1 would be a 3 would be a C, or you can make that 13, which is M. 0 will correspond to O, 8 will correspond to H, and 7 will correspond to G. Okay, so where did this version of the calendar without a 0 come from in the first place? Well, it was the Romans. So when the Roman calendar came out, they did not have a 0. Most people, most civilizations outside of our initiatory circles, they did not have a concept of 0 until around 600 AD, when India kind of led the charge on making that idea public, the idea of the cipher. Okay, but there were problems that came along with that because there were multiple understandings of the word cipher, multiple understandings of the number 0, that unless you were kind of trained to understand that, it could cause some confusion. All right, so just to show you, if we're dealing with systems that assign letters to these numbers, the Hebrews did it, the Arabs did it, India, their whole system is based on math and things. So this is something that was very, very common. And I demonstrated in the first video how that one number that's square root of 2, how it basically told the story of Thales and what his name and his story really mean. Okay, so in this case, if we have a Roman system that is without 0, we get this word Moog. Okay, so it is understood that this, so even in sound, it sounds like Moog, M-O-G-H, but it is explicitly stated that this is just a variant of that same word, and that word means it appears in a number of languages, but particularly Irish is one that really stands out. But it means bond, servant, or slave. So we've got a situation here where it appears that you have one date that was determined by a culture who may have had a concept of 0 that lands us at 13,086, but it appears that this 0 being removed by the Romans, who were enslaving folks left and right. When you have the Romans take that 0 out, we're instead pointing at 13,087 BC as this date of the current Quran. So Quran is a 25,000 year cycle, and we basically write the events of that cycle ahead of time, not in retrospect. So this idea of writing history as an account of things that happen is a purely uninitiated idea that we mathematically plan out a whole. So you have a different creator, a different architect at the beginning of each of these Quran periods, who basically lays down the structure of how reality is going to play out. And that can easily be done simply by the way language works, the understanding of how language and the way that we produce voice interacts with the dielectric property of the blood. So remember earlier I was talking about that thing about did I say that to you, or was I reading it from my previous? But blood is affected by the introduction of electric field. So if I didn't say that already, this is something that was understood back then. And like I said in the last video, different blood types have a different dielectric frequency value or whatever. So different frequencies have different effects on different people depending on what your blood type. And yes, certain blood types tend to be more common among certain races. So if you have an extensive understanding of that, you could use something as simple as knowing how to harness electricity in something similar to a Leyden jar. The Ark of the Covenant was basically a big old Leyden jar, and you won't hear this from many people, but allowing them to store electric charge in a way that actually allows long distance communication, perhaps even between realms. But that's a whole nother rabbit hole to go into. Okay, so we got this year 1. So exactly half of this. So remember, you have to know from these lessons, this is where you learn about these 25,000 year periods that are coordinated with the rotation of the earth, which is approximately 25,000 miles circumference. And so that tells you that we're dealing with circles, cycles, all of these things that are associated with cipher, which is that number we call 0. So all of that is relevant to this conversation. So if you understand the cycles, if you understand the time, you realize that it isn't nearly as important for a date in the past or a historical event in the past. You understand the structure of time itself. You see how all these things are still happening right now and the influences that are playing into that. Okay, so let's go through the line and look at the effects of the way we look at events if we have without 0 that 13,087 versus with the 0 that 13,086. So exactly half of that 25,000 year period would be 12,500 years. So in the exact middle, we've got, boom, the siege of Jerusalem. So like I said, it's either 586 BC or it's 587 BC. Just like with 13,086, this doesn't have a clear cut word that can be made from the entire date. So it's questionable what the significance of it is besides 1308 spelling Moch, which is a concept in the East related to the attachment to physical reality. And that is important to this overall situation. So you can even look at it here. If you looked at that as Mo 7, 7 in the supreme mathematics is Allah God. So if you have this idea of being attached to material reality, the effect that has on God becomes enslaved. So it still works on that level. And in this case, that would be the attachment to materiality as it relates to equality. Thinking things are the same. And so that's exactly the problem that we're having here, where they're treating the years 586 and 587 as if they're the same thing. Like they don't know which one was the actual siege of Jerusalem by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. Remember, we're talking about the Matrix. Nebuchadnezzar was the name of Morpheus's ship, and Morpheus was the name of the god of dreams. So that's the same name shared by the lead character in the Sandman comic book series. So Nebuchadnezzar, whose name means Nebu, protect my air. That Nebu is because in the mythology is considered the son of Marduk and is considered in some cases synonymous with Thoth from the Egyptian mythologies, but in some cases he can almost be looked at as a replacement for Thoth, like a stand-in or a projection. So the significance of this 587 versus the 586 is that 587, fifth letter is E, eighth letter is H, seventh letter is G. That gives us this word egg. And it apparently, according to Wiktionary, which I advise that you get that app so you can look at both the definitions and etymology history of words and how they transformed over time. But apparently in German, egg is the name Egon, which means sword edge. So the edge of a sword. So the significance of this 7 is that the 7th letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Zayin, is understood to have a meaning of sword, which corresponds to the 7th letter of the Arabic alphabet to give you purifier. And when you put those two meanings together, you basically get projection, the idea of sending something out in order to clear something up, a projection. So you can look at that as shooting an arrow as projection, but at the same time, shining light on something is projection, or creating a virtual experience that is supposed to explain something is a projection. So all of those concepts are captured within that particular year and that word as the middle. Whenever we take out that 0 and we end up starting out as slaves, bond service, or whatever, we've got this central point, this idea of a projection, a simulation associated with the siege of Jerusalem. And mind you, the Temple of Solomon, which was said to have been destroyed right then, is an esoteric symbol for the body. So the beast body, quote unquote, which the light enters in order to enlighten man, and so that he becomes conscious and aware of his faculties and can advance his spiritual development. This is a understanding that is known to the Freemasons, is known to the gods. Anybody who has been properly trained in those meanings recognizes that meaning I'm telling you now when it comes to King Solomon. I will do another video. I feel like I've done it already, or at least wrote something about it. I might not have made that public yet. But basically you had 3 traditions. We got black seeds, brown seeds, and yellow seeds. That corresponds to what we typically think of as an African. The brown corresponds to what we typically consider as India. And the yellow seed corresponds to what we typically associate with Chinese people, and so on and so forth. So basically we got us in the West, the brown folks in the middle or the Middle East, and then the Far East is where our yellow seeds are. They correspond to knowledge, wisdom, understanding, respectively. And so the same relationships that are found in the supreme mathematics with regards to 1, 2, and 3, aka knowledge, wisdom, understanding, apply in that case as well. And you've actually seen history unfold in that way. So it shows you that we have this joint system of mathematical calculation that is actually unfolding in reality in a identical way. All right, moving right along. So we got the midpoint. So we got this bookend, the beginning. We've got the center point. We've got this going on. And then on the far end, we end up with these 2 dates here. So the end of that Quran period, according to that specific set of dates, gives us either 1914 AD or 11,914 AD or 11,915. Now, in the case of 11,914, that gives us either the word Assad or the word kin. So those 2 things are going to work together. So Assad is it comes from an Arabic word that is used for lion in a lot of other languages, but apparently that original word, that Assad, it didn't just apply to a lion, but to a beast of prey is what they called it, and it applied to both lions and dogs. So if you know anything about mythology, if you know anything about ufology, and they talk about these different races of, like, lions are usually associated with a cat-like race that they call the Lyrans, because they are from the Lyra star system, according to those stories.
And then you'll hear a lot about the dogs. The dog star is Sirius. So you hear about the dog star. You hear about Sirius. They associate that with Anubis in some cases over in the Egyptian pantheon. But these symbols are very common. And so, again, the beast body is what we were talking about with Solomon's temple, where you have the beast that naturally evolved on planet Earth, and then at some point through a specific process becomes enlightened and becomes aware of himself and is able to stop worrying about the process of physical evolution and begin moving to the stages of spiritual evolution in a stable form. Okay, so we're seeing this entire process play out in these years over the span of this 25,000 years. And so, in addition to Assad, that same set of numbers can correspond to Ken, 11, 9, 14 versus 1, 19, 1, 4. Okay, so Ken gives us, it's associated with familial links, so your family link, as well as it can mean likeness. So mankind is like man. And a fascinating etymology about the word family is that it actually comes from words meaning slave, as well as slave itself being related to Slav. So that starts getting into some things about Cyrillic. Remember, in the previous video, that message came out to us in the form of Cyrillic. So the Slavs are one of these peoples who were using the Cyrillic language. And so part of the reason that they were enslaving Slavs was because of this mathematical interface. So a lot of the events that have played out on planet Earth, it wasn't just random targeting by one empire on a particular set of people or whatever else. Everybody was looking at this same set of information that was presented in mathematical form, and then they were left to, among themselves, figure out the correct interpretation. But as you can see, you think that you're doing the righteous thing because you're using the math, but if you start out from the wrong dates because you haven't been taught how to determine your starting point, so that when you're told to subtract this or add that you end up on the right year, and you begin translating from there, you see how you can have two entirely different trajectories. So here, without that zero, we get another word that can mean slave or servant, connecting to this one right here. So on both ends, you got this situation of slave and servant. It's just that it's giving you more context on the other end. Now, with that zero still in place, it instead gives us 11, 9, 15. So in this case, one of the words that comes out of it is ashe, like this. And, we say ashe still to this day, West Africa, different place, with authority, right? Well, where does your authority come from? The authority comes from God, right? Well, apparently this word spelt like this, it comes in several languages, including Germanic languages, Nordic, all these different languages. It means ashes. And ashes comes from etymology meaning like to burn and things of that nature, where the word black also means to burn or shine. Okay, and then ash spelled with that, so you got that that letter, the ash symbol, that is that it looks like a combination of an A and an E that they used to use in Old English. That the rune for that in Norse, the older Norse languages and the Elder Futhark and all of that stuff, it means God. So it means oak, like an oak tree. It's an ash tree. So you had the ash tree was the man, and then you had the oak tree, which was associated with the woman. But that ash symbol was understood also to mean God. So if we have ashe, which is ashes plural, they're talking about the gods. So naturally, you can see how that would be more advantageous as an interpretation. However, even that, with its separation between whether somebody is God or slave, that still wasn't the intention. Because mind you, and we'll get into this a little bit more, there's more than one way to look at zero, and you need to have all understandings of them in order to see it completely. So whenever you would see something with a value of 1,000 times something, like it would have those three after it, those could be looked at as having an esoteric meaning of the union between those three ciphers. So it would be, you can look at it as a trinity. Like three circles is a symbol of the trinity, even when it appears as the zeros in a multiple of 1,000. Okay, so let's get back to Thales. Now, Thales, his famous eclipse, again, remember, it was 585 BC. Now, unless you knew this context and you knew that there was already some kind of thing going on, some kind of confusion going on with these years 587 and 586, which are so close to the siege of Jerusalem, you wouldn't even think to associate the eclipse of 585 with any of this. However, there's some key events that happen as a result of this eclipse that show you that they're pointing towards something that is one and the same. Now, one of the things that was important about that eclipse is that it instantly ended a conflict that was going on between the Lydians and the Medes. So these were two tribes that were duking it out in ancient Iran. So the Aryans, quote unquote, Aryan comes from Iran. Now, remember the Yoruba of West Africa, they too descend from this region. So the Fertile Crescent, Middle East, so on and so forth. They are related to these, and we still call Iran Yoruba on that side too. So it's still even in the name of some of them. And so you can look at it if you know anything about who the Lydians were, and then there was a lot of confusion with the Medes. Now, in a lot of the texts, a lot of historical quote unquote texts, much of it is speculation, and the way they've depicted different peoples at any given time is largely based on speculation. So especially if they were a darker skinned people and it didn't benefit the narrative by making somebody else look superior, oftentimes they would just take a guess and they would give you a black and white picture of people that may have had curly hair and curly beards, but not specifying whether those people were white or black, because they thought it was arbitrary. But people who feel like they have the advantage always see things that are important to other people as being arbitrary. But based on what I can tell from the various studying the various myths and studying the various regions of the world, is that these two groups may very well correspond to the Aya and the Appa, which represent Vishnu and Shiva accordingly. And they come together in the myths to have a child named Ayappa, who is considered the union and the peace between the Shivites who worship Shiva and the Vaishnavites that worship Vishnu. And so you basically had these two groups that were worshiping specific archetypes. One you could look at as the divine masculine, and one is the divine feminine, white and black accordingly. And this eclipse represented the peace between those, and that's essentially what you get with an eclipse if you think about it, because you've got an object that doesn't have light of its own obscuring the light of the sun, such that you get a black figure with a white ring on the edges of it. And so that is highly symbolic in many, many ways, but especially considering that this year is supposed to be the midpoint of a 25,000 year cycle, it automatically kind of positions the possibility that the two bookends, the beginning and the end, are actually representing one side or the other, and these two peoples serving as kind of poles for each other, and they meet in the middle, and that's what creates this star effect, this toroidal field, and that's basically the main events that are shaping our reality with regards to black and white, and so in these seemingly opposing forces. All right, now Medes itself, it already looks like some of the etymologies and some of the proposals that they made for where this name comes from, because they don't know, includes the middle or the median. Well, just judging by West African pronunciations and the way certain things are written, knowing that the Yoruba are connected to this region, then we know that that D and that R may be interchangeable because of how it's pronounced. That mere. So you had the Nri Igbo, you had Nri Igbo. You see it both spelled as Nri and Ndi. So if we made that a R, that connects us to a number of other words which have similar meaning that connect us to Meru, because like you had the Medu Neter, which was the name of the alphabet of the Egyptians, where if we call it Meru, Meru Neter, basically the Moorish gods or Moorish nature. Um, Meru means navel, like in the Indian mythology. Meru is this legendary mountain that's in the middle of the world, and Shiva sits upon it, and so on and so forth. So there's all kind of metaphor associated with that. So if that is associated with Meru, it makes sense that it aligns with Appa, because Appa is the Tamil, the South Indian, the dark skinned Indians, their word for Shiva, and Aya is their word for Vishnu. All right. And so there were a Meru people who lived near the Horn of Africa, I believe in Kenya, long time ago. They may still be there, but they've been there a very, very long time. And if you look at the various myths and legends, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're talking about there may be a physical mountain. Like they even say that the Great Pyramid is at the navel of the world, but what it's talking about, the navel of this reality altogether, is the original black man. Why? Because we were the combination of the divine masculine and the divine feminine. We got our masculine from our physical gender, but our skin, that dark skin, is associated with the divine feminine aspect that is able to draw in light. So that pull aspect is the divine feminine. And so our ability to absorb and process sunlight into other forms of energy was the union between the masculine and feminine. And you can look at our melanin as being sort of the umbilical cord, that which absorbs from the cosmos in the form of its ability to absorb and transform light in that way. Okay, so what happens when we place 585 as our center point? Now, mind you, it already does one thing where they said in the academia they consider that the first confirmed event. That doesn't mean it actually happened. That just means that that's what everybody decided to agree upon and base all of their sciences on. But at any rate, 585 BC comes after both 587 and 586 BC. So it's basically a declaration that we don't care what year you say or what you think that year was. Nothing can be confirmed. Nothing is real until 585. And why would they do that? A few reasons. Okay, so it will give us a starting date of 13085 BC, which gives us Mohe, so Mohe. So there's two, if you combine a couple, so I'll give you a few meanings for this word because it's very interesting. And it corresponds with this idea of the three cultures, the black seed, brown seed, and yellow seed, and then having to bring those together, those meanings together in order to find the real underlying meaning. Now, Mohe in Chinese is made up of the characters for desert and river. And together it basically means to separate or to leave union. That is important because union is the etymology, the meaning of the word yoga. So the unity between the individual soul and the cosmic soul, and understanding that these two things are one in the same. That's going to come up in a minute too, and it does have something to do with both this concept of meeting in the middle, as well as the fact that between the black seed, brown seed, and yellow seed, the brown are in the middle. So keep that in mind. Okay. Mohe So that's the yellow seed definition. The brown seed definition would be attached to that concept I talked about earlier. So this is a variant or a conjugation, if you will, of that word moha or mohe, which means attachment to the material world. Now, another interesting meaning that I came across was the Cherokee Indians, who so the Native Americans over here, they are exiles from the original people of India and Africa. So they're still part of that same lineage. They just had to make some moves, and then they came, and came where they came. Now, the Cherokee definition of this word is elk. ELK. So like the big deer looking thing. Why is that important? Because I found that this word elk, this symbol elk, pops up in a lot of old mythology and things. And the word originally comes from a meaning of red brown. So reddish brown, red or brown. And this is because the elk, the animal, is named that because of the color of its fur. So it's not the other way around. It's not that the elk came first. It's this word for reddish brown or red or brown came first. And then they were named that because of the color of their fur. Why is that important? Because the Ethiopians, remember, we're talking about these Greek philosophers and so on and so forth in Greece back during the time of like Homer when he was writing the Odyssey. The land of Ethiopia, which was spelled with that A-E, so that same H. So we already know that that letter H, that A-E, means God already. That's what the original spelling of Ethiopia was. It was A-E-T-H-I-O-P-I-A. And it was the name of everything below the equator. So it wasn't just the country Ethiopia today, but all of that. And specifically, the eastern part of Africa was largely understood to be Western Ethiopia. That's where Western Ethiopia starts. And then Southern India was largely recognized to be where Eastern Ethiopia started. So there's a lot of confusion today when we talk about Ethiopians and people originating from Ethiopia and the Aksumite Empire and stuff like that. It was not just isolated to that one area where the country is today. All of that, even the Atlantic Ocean below the equator, was known as the Ethiopian Ocean. So because South America was bordering that ocean, it too was considered part of that Ethiopia. So that whole strip, Australia on the opposite side. So all of that. And then to this day, you see those are where we have the highest concentrations. Like all those places below the equator is where we have the highest concentrations of dark skinned peoples. Okay. The other significance of the word elk, there's two other things that I'll go ahead and give to you now because it is relevant to this thing. So we got Ethiopian, meaning reddish brown faced people. So red brown faced people is what the word Ethiopia was understood to mean by like the Greeks and whoever else. And remember in the Odyssey, they went to go visit the gods. They wanted to ask a favor, but the gods were away in the land of the Ethiopians. So Zeus and Poseidon, all of them, they don't really tell you the reason, but we know the reason why they came. Like Zeus is considered the grandfather of the Ethiopians because his son Epaphus, according to their myths, is the father of the Ethiopians. So why wouldn't the Ethiopians' parents look like them? Like that's one of those weird semantics that only in America, well, not just America, but that same mentality, like why can't it be that? Well, the Elk Lodge, so if you're familiar with the Elk Lodge, this was largely created. All right, so I'll give you the reason why it was actually created, but what it became known for was being different from the Masonic Lodge in that the Elks Lodge accepted membership from both men and women. So whereas the Masonic lodges of that time were exclusively men, the Elks, they allowed men and women. Now, the whole reason the Elks Lodge was created in the first place was that there was actually a group, a minstrel group. So this was a group of white people who would dress up in blackface for entertainment, because the leading form of entertainment that allowed the music industry to really kick off and start becoming a profitable thing was minstrel shows. So these people, these white people who would dress up as black people with exaggerated features and spin these yarns of them being either lazy or hypersexual and trying to come get their white women. So they were out here doing this and they were making good money doing it. And so in this particular case, this group, one of their comrades, he fell on hard times. He might have been sick or something like that. And if I recall, I don't think they were successful in being able to raise money for him in time. But case in point, the whole reason for them forming the Elks Lodge in the first place was so that those minstrel performers could be able to come together for like causes like that. So we've got this idea of the elk, this word for elk showing up here. We've got both the association with the Ethiopians as red, brown faced people. And then we've actually got a tradition of people dressing in blackface, dressing up like black people for entertainment. And so this is one of those places that shows that you have a clear connection and understanding on the parts of these individuals for those specific meanings. These are things that are taught within the esoteric traditions associated with some of the groups that I've named. So this is something that is known from the original people all the way to the devils we taught, to the Muslim sons, and so on and so forth, because the Shriners are actually initiates of the Moors, of the original people. And so they have part of our teachings. Musa, when he came and gave those cave dwellers that knowledge, he didn't give them the complete knowledge. He gave them mostly that trick knowledge, what they needed in order to rule something, in order to build homes for themselves, and so on and so forth. But they still only had partial meanings, and then had to take it upon themselves to actually go back to the Egyptians, go back to the Africans, and learn the additional meanings, underlying meanings. And I'll show you how important that is in a minute as well. So the final thing I wanted to point out with elk is the pyramid. Okay, so the Great Pyramid, which we call the Great Pyramid, which may not be the actual original Great Pyramid, is typically associated with the Khufu Pyramid, the largest of the three on the Giza Plateau. The Great Pyramid, it has a slope of its sides that is 51.84 degrees. So as letters, that 5184 gives you ERD. So Erd is an old spelling of the word for earth. So this is why that structure has so many parallels and proportions and things associated with the shape of the earth. There is so much math embedded in that structure. I concluded that that particular structure is more tied to the traditions that are associated with Sumeria and Babylon, because you know Nebuchadnezzar, he ruled in Egypt for a while, and the Sumerians are Eshu. Hold on, how do you pronounce it? Eshu Emri. Well, their name actually comes from an Igbo word, and so they are they're connected to a tradition that extends all the way back to West Africa. How long it had been since they had any contact with West Africa, that's, for you to, look up and find out, and whatever else. One place I would definitely look at is the Igbo History Museum. So you'll have to type that in and Google it, because I think there's like a misspelling in the website name or something, but it's a Weebly site, and it's the Igbo Museum, Igbo History Museum, IGBO. And Dr. Catherine, boy, don't make me mispronounce her name, or Cholonwu, I want to say is how her name is pronounced. She was this brilliant understanding of language, math, history, all these things, and she put extensive research into showing how like the largely forgotten totems and even pyramids of West Africa are left out of the conversation, and how all of these languages and cultures around the world stem from this group of West Africans. And mind you, it's all associated back to the Kwa people. So whether you're Igbo, Yoruba, many of the West African tribes are descendants of this same group of Kwa people in the area, and in language systems that are very numerical based. And I very often find words that are either Igbo, Yoruba, or Egyptian in these numbers, these key numbers associated with mathematical constants in physics and things of that nature. So there is a clear precedent for the idea of these language systems being constructed with mathematical understanding. Okay. And so anyway, so the slope, and the reason I say that this version of the Great Pyramid, because the original Great Pyramid may actually be the Joseph Pyramid up in Saqqara. It's older, but you see there's a difference in the design where you have the step pyramids in Saqqara, which are similar to the step pyramids around the world, but then you've got this one over here on the Giza Plateau, which has this triangular sort of design that meets at an apex at the top. And if you look at it from above, you can see that it's not just like, depending on how the sun is hitting, you'll see that it's not just 4 lines that you see because it has 4 faces. It's actually 8 faces because each of the faces dents inward. So what you have is 8 lines. And so this concept of the 8-pointed star, you see that across the board in the Brown Seed region, which would include like the Sumerian traditions, but also in India, where you have like the Dharma wheel associated with Buddha and Krishna and these different folks like this. So this is a shared tradition, and these ideas are what is being channeled through this particular structure of this Great Pyramid. And so the Great Pyramid is basically a giant replica of the Cave of Brahma, which is the 3rd ventricle of the brain. And so that's a video for another day. We would be here forever if I got into that right now, but I have to do one on it after this. But just know that that's essentially what's coming together right there. And the relevance of that is also, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself a little bit, but that being inside of the head, and being able, how it shapes reality when vibration is sent through that structure, it shows that a lot of their technology, a lot of their architecture was based on a profound understanding of the body. And in fact, the first line of Genesis, when written in Hebrew, in the beginning, is Bereshit. And so what that actually translates to, it can be translated as in the beginning, but it can also be interpreted as in the head, with that resh, meaning Lord, radiance, or head. So it can mean in the head. So in the beginning of the Bible, read that as in the head, and that just changes your whole perspective on what it could be. And then it doesn't mean that it is one and not the other. It means that that same underlying structure, energy, was informing both possibilities. Okay. And so you have that going on, the Great Pyramid. However, there's a very important geometrical relationship that comes from, if you've ever held a block in your hand, like you had a cubic block, like a toy block, like your kids play with, and you've had that in your hand, and you hold that 3D, then you know that if you look at it at a flat face of that cube, you basically have a square. However, if you're looking at it to where you can see 3 sides at the same time by, turning it, having a corner pointed towards you, it kind of makes the top square look more like a diamond, like a flattened diamond type of thing or whatever, which we call a rhombus. If you draw a cube on a piece of paper, then if you're drawing it to where you can see those 6 outside points simultaneously, and you see 3 faces simultaneously with the midpoint, that shape is a rhombus. And so you have a shape called the golden rhombus, which is its proportions of its width to its height give you the golden ratio, this mathematical constant that shows up everywhere in the designs of our body, the spirals of seashells, and the way that even galaxies arrange themselves and planets arrange themselves. So this is a central concept, an important number, if you didn't get the gist of that from my other videos. Now, I got curious one morning. I woke up and I wanted to know what angle you needed to tilt a flat surface, a square surface, such that it became a rhombus in your line of vision. And I wasn't aware at the time when I was doing this, but then I ended up finding out that that concept is at play when magnetic fields cut themselves on and off. So when the magnet is facing flat at you like that square, it resists the formation of magnetic fields. When you tilt that thing to where it looks like a rhombus, that actually causes a paramagnetic effect. So a paramagnetic effect is something that our melanin does, where it's able to imitate the magnetic field of an incoming magnetic field, in our case, sunlight. So as sunlight is coming in, our melanin is able to imitate the magnetic field of that sun and then basically use that information to do processes. So in other words, when they call us the son of man, it's because our skin, our melanin, actually has the ability to imitate the magnetic properties of the sun. Not nearly on the same magnitude, of course, but just information wise, it can translate that into a microcosm that informs several processes on the cellular and atomic level. And so the angle that comes out of that, the angle that allows you to transform that square into that golden rhombus, is 5.1, so 51.27 degrees. So that Great Pyramid was 51.84 degrees, but this one is 51.27 degrees. Now the letters from that 5127 give you the letters ELG. So ELG. Apparently, because of the transformations that the letter G made to K in Asia, that ELG, that ELG spelling, is considered to be another version of elk. It's not something I'm making up or that I want to happen. That's what the etymology says. It says that spelling is probably a older spelling of the word elk, showing you that this was an older understanding of these slopes and this information. Now, in addition to that, once again, meaning reddish brown and then pointing toward the Ethiopians, the other significance of it is that that exact same angle, the exact same slope, is what you get if you make a three-dimensional model of the relationship between wavelength and frequency. So when you map those values, you basically get something that's like, if you've ever seen those pictures of like a wormhole or whatever, it looks something like this. And this is a shape that's very much associated with how black holes work and these toroidal fields we're talking about. So that middle part where stuff goes into the middle of the donut, you can look at that structure as the middle of the donut, the tube. And so when you take a cross section of that at 51.27 degrees exactly, it gives you a golden oval. So in other words, just like how you had the rhombus where the proportion between the height and the width gave you the golden ratio, you now have an oval that does the same thing in this model of the relationship between wavelength and sound. So when we talk about wavelength and sound, you can equate that to the relationship between magnetism and electricity. You can relate that to the relationship between the masculine and the feminine. Okay, and so we've got this interesting connection between red brown, which is a reference to the color of these people's melanin, and we have melanin, which has the ability to form a paramagnetic relationship with the incoming light of the sun, also being represented in this point that is at the center, this shape that's at the center of this structure, which also resembles the event horizon of a black hole, which we'll get into in a minute. So all of these concepts is showing you that all these concepts are mathematically linked, and melanin plays a role in it. All right, let's move along. So we got that. So that's just that end. That's just so 585 gives us a beginning of that Quran period as being 13,085 BC. Now, the midpoint, so the exact date of the eclipse was May 28th, 585 BC. So 528, like if you've been doing this as long as I have, you recognize that 528 as one, it is a Hertz frequency associated with, I believe it was either the E or the F key. I believe it was the F key maybe. When you tune A on the piano to 432 Hertz. So it was one of those types of relationships. But more importantly, this is the reverse of another number which shows up in some interesting places, which I'll show you in a future video. But this number 825 shows up in very interesting places. 825. So the reverse of this is 825. Why is that interesting? Because in the supreme alphabet, the 8th letter, H, we call that He. The 25th letter, so 8 and 25, the 25th letter we call Y, like the question why. And when you put those together, 825, it gives you He Y. And if you look at that backwards, well, I should, so instead of Y, so it should be, if I write that exactly backwards, it's going to give me, hold on. If I write it exactly backwards, it's going to be just like that. So He Y backwards is Yahweh. So this gives where we get the name Yahweh. Now, the reason that's significant is because He is a Proto-Indo-European spelling of Hewas, which was a Proto-Indo-European god who corresponds to Vayu. So you know how that W and that V exchange over there, Vayu, who is the god of breath. So not just the god of wind, but the god of breath over there. I actually wrote about Vayu, like before I knew all this stuff, I actually wrote about Vayu in my book of wind that I wrote in 2014 and I sent to the Pope. So if you didn't see my other video on that, that story's in there. But that's significant because the Vayu is also the name of the energy channel in the body. So it's talking about the pranic body, the vital body, the life force body. And it ties very much into the story that we ended up with in the West of God breathing air into Adam. And so as I explained before as well, with the word Adam being related to both red and earth, this idea of sending breath into it and it being associated with the vital body and sending energy into it, we're not just talking about sending breath into the into earth or a body. We're talking about sending life force into it. And so this very much mirrors the myth about Hanuman. And that's why I brought him up earlier. This one who they made to be a monkey, but the race that he was, the Vanaras, the word Vanara actually means forest dwellers. And this is a description that is actually associated with the Igbo and West Africans who evolved from Homo erectus and became the first Homo sapiens. And so Vanara is very much possibly a reference to these older people, these original people. Okay, and so in that story, um, Hanuman is born by so Shiva and his wife Shakti, who represent like the primordial void, the cosmic everything, and then Shakti is like space, force, like just all of the Akashic um elements of electromagnetism, just all those forces. So the two of them, they took the form of Vanaras in the story so that they could fool around, and they were getting down, and they wanted their little Vanara seed to be planted in a Vanara woman. And so Vayu was the god that facilitated it. He transferred that fertilized seed into Hanuman's mother. And so we got a very similar story to Jesus. And what you'll find is that biblical story surrounding Jesus has all the same underlying meanings as this particular story, as well as the story of Horus, which I'm actually getting to in a second. And it's all based on this particular process that happens all throughout reality and is rooted in the structure of reality itself. All right, so we had this point over here where we're leaving union, but then over here, the year 585, Ehe, is a word that means marriage. And then I want to say that this was capitalized, so it's a proper noun or whatever, but it's marriage, and it comes from a Proto-Germanic word, awas, which also means law and custom. Law comes from a word that basically means to connect or bind, so connection or collect, and so it shows you that yes, we're on the right track with these meanings. Now, awas is a very interesting word because it comes up in various cultures with respect to like that awo root, the AIW. It shows up in several places related to the to life force. And so one of the words that where we get Eve from, so the story of Adam and Eve, it actually comes from this same root, and shows that she actually means life force. So when you're talking about Adam interacting with the God of breath, receiving the breath of God, you see how that reverses. So we got Yahweh in one case who gave the breath of God, but then we got Haywire who was the God of breath. So you could tell that it was an intentional understanding and flipping of this, such that if you were in a culture who reads from right to left, you are going to interpret something written left to right very differently. So that was something that appears to have been intentional. Now, Awas is especially interesting because Awas is the name of an entity that was channeled in Egypt by the nefarious and infamous Aleister Crowley, who was a magician. He did all the magic. He didn't care whether it was black magic, white magic, purple, green. He did all of it because he wanted to understand it and demystify it and just know every aspect of it. And so in this particular book called the Book of the Law, so there's that law that comes up again, he channels this being called Awa. So this book is full of coded terminology that is meant to only be understood by somebody who gets initiated and understands those underlying meanings, because it either doesn't make sense at all to you on the surface, or it sounds very scary and abrasive and nasty and all sorts of other things. But if you understand the underlying meanings that are woven into it and that he lets you know are woven into it, then you'll get the real meaning that he's showing you. And so Awas, this being who in depictions looked a lot like one of those organic grays. So like, when they talk about aliens, you have the gray aliens, they got the big black eyes and they got the gray skin and however many fingers or whatever else. But you also have organic grays, because those ones that I just described are like robot bodies, and they say any race could rent one of those bodies and just use that to come down here and mess with us. So it's actually more like a suit. But the organic ones that just get lumped into that same category because of their heritage. So they descend from a particular lineage. They have eyes and nose. They look pretty much like humans, except they're short and have big old heads. So if they were wearing a hat or something, you wouldn't be able to tell them from a short human. They just have like kind of slanty eyes. They look like little Asian people, sort of. Black people from the islands who look kind of like this, except they don't have the huge top of the head. And they say that was because they began to prioritize development of the mind and the intellect, and they kind of started to abandon the emotions. So that's a side effect that begins to happen when you're not using the emotional centers. These other centers associated with intellect tend to develop, and the others start to diminish. So if you're given long enough as a species of humans, that's pretty much what they would say will happen to you. So you can look at these as, in some cases in the stories, they talk about these being humans from the future who have been altered significantly due to, their choices and the way that they were experimenting on themselves. Even in the stories of Yaqub in the Nation of Islam, you hear that he had a beyond normal head size and would get teased for it and stuff like this. So you see this overlap in cultures that seem to have nothing to do with each other, but you see the same overlap. But anyways, Aiwass appeared as this sort of figure, but he also identified himself as being Horus. So Horus from the Egyptian pantheon, and he was a manifestation of Horus, and is sometimes depicted with his hawk head form and all of that stuff in the writings. Now, I've said this before and I'm going to say it again. One thing that has been whipping humanity's ass for thousands of years is the pronunciation of the letter H. Because in Hebrew, you have the fifth letter, which corresponds to our letter E, which is called He, so H-E-H. But then you have the eighth letter, which corresponds to our letter H, which is called Chet, so C-H-E-T. So that's why they do that Hanukkah thing. All right. So if you don't know which one to use, you may interpret the word entirely differently. So Horus is also associated in Gnosticism with this concept of the Horus, and I'll explain that in a minute. And then his older name is Heru. So Heru is where we get the word hero. The place where Thales of Miletus is born, it has that same root in it, that same Heru root in it. And we're not going to get into that with this video too much, but it shows that he's very much connected to the same thing we're talking about right here. So he may have been a cleverly crafted character associated with this mystery tradition. Now, the thing about, so the Horus, well, I'll start with that, is associated with the Aeon. So if you know anything about the Aeons in Gnosticism, make sure you look that up. But Horus, in addition to being the child archetype, so the child of, in Egypt, that would be the child of Osiris and Isis. He also predates everybody. So he's primordial. So there's a primordial form of him and there's a child form. And you can relate this to the invisible Father, everything God from the Bible compared to Jesus as God in the flesh. So both exist simultaneously, but are essentially the same thing. So that was a concept that was associated with the Horus. And so the Horus only appears in that final form as a way to form a shell or a membrane around something to hold its energy in, so that it doesn't automatically return to the Godhead. So it doesn't automatically return to the essence. And so that concept is what allows us to have cells, to have individual bodies, like anything that allows something to exist individually without becoming immediately absorbed into something else, is this Horus concept. And that's what he represents. With Heru, him being associated with hero is associated with something in tarot called the hero's journey, which is takes the so the 0 card is the fool and basically plays the role of the hero. and it walks around this circle that is formed by the other 21, the cards numbered 1 through 21 of the major arcana, and goes through each one of these steps to go through an alchemical process of self-transformation and realization. So the Fool starts and ends in the same place. Just like a circle, the top point would be 0 degrees, and then when you go around the full circle 360 degrees, winds up in the exact same place as that 0 degrees, which is why this idea of zero, which I wrote, where did I put it? Zero, yeah, it's right here. So this is why this idea of zero being more than one thing is important, because you realize that the starting point and the ending point are in the same place, but the difference is that I could have sworn I put this thing on do not disturb. Hold on a second. But you realize that the yes, it winds up in the same position, but it has gained value over that time. It's gained experience over that time. So that's the difference between 0 and 360 degrees, even though they're in the same position. Now, if you don't know whether somebody's been on a journey, you will assume that they haven't been on one. If you look at, there's a difference between somebody who is carefree because they don't know better versus somebody who's carefree because they know too much to be worried. Right? So that's the purpose of the Fool card, and that's what we're talking about here. So you've got the same thing happen in the beginning and the end, unless you're able to see past the surface and see what it has collected in terms of experience. So that's where we get this Horus. So if that H, if it turns out that that's actually a Chet, then that would be Horus. And Chorus, chorus, like the word that we use, chorus. Well, what is a chorus? A chorus is a collection, a gathering of people such that their voices come together and make one sound. Chorus actually comes from an etymology meaning enclosure. So an enclosure is when, like I've explained in another video, we're talking about when you have chaos and you have all sorts of sound and vibrations and stuff, you need to form a shell around those vibrations such that it can become a closed system and it can develop independently of what's outside of it, so things can grow and and come into being. And so similarly, you think about that with our planet. Like the planet, the way that we're taught is that it had to form an atmosphere, it had to form a dome to enclose everything inside of it so that it could develop independently from the rest of the cosmos and have unique things happening on Earth. All right. So this is because it is this enclosure, this encircling concept is embodied by the word chorus. Given the definitions of Horus and Heru I just gave you, this shows you that that H is probably supposed to be a Het and not a He. So otherwise it would just be Orus. Orus, which does actually sound very close to like oratory, like a mouth, but that would infer a single mouth, whereas a chorus is a combination of mouths making sound to come together to make a single sound. Likewise, don't quote me on this because it's been a while since I've looked at it, but if I remember correctly, Heru doing the same thing, it also has a meaning somewhat associated to like peace and calm and order. And so order is important because order is associated with peace, and it's the opposite of chaos. Now, when we talk about collection and gathering, Heru, if we put that C in front of it, it looks a lot like cherub. And so there are connected roots to that, but they're spelled with a K, so the Kheru. So a cherub should actually be pronounced a cherub. All right. And so you hear the stories in the Bible talking about the cherubs who were the ones who, like, you had an angel that was supposed to protect the Garden of Eden. You got these cherubs that are preventing entry into it. These are high-ranking angels in the story. And if you've ever watched any of the stuff by Matias De Stefano, this guy from South America, who he teaches mostly in Spanish, but he has these initiation videos that are on Gaia and some public stuff out there too. But when he goes through it, he's talking about like the different densities of reality and all these different beings and so on and so forth. He describes the cherubs as actually being these fields. They're like basically in the form of these toroidal fields that are an enclosure for the center point, which is connected to the enclosure. So I described in the last video how our breath does that exact same thing. Whereas our breath is made of the same thing and doing the same things as the atmosphere. It's just that the atmosphere is scaled up, and it is the collective, see that collective, the gathering of all the breath on the planet. And so it creates this connected network that is very much operational the same way that a toroidal field is. Okay, so the etymology of cherub, it comes from, you got ancient Greek, but then the ancient Greeks got it from the Hebrew for cabbage. And the word cabbage, it isn't just slang that we use it for head. It actually comes from an etymology for head. And remember, I said, in the beginning can translate to in the head. So it's talking about this right here. The beginning, according to the Bible, was talking mainly about the creation of the earth and how the heavens are seen from earth. Okay, so there we make all these assumptions about the universe, blah, 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 blah. But it's important to recognize that in Genesis, it's talking specifically about the creation of earth as viewed from earth. And for it to have this etymology that's relating something like a toroidal field, just like the magnetic field we have around the planet, to a head, it shows that they're acknowledging the similarity between these concepts, if not telling you that's what they're saying in the first place. Okay, so everything in the old teachings appears to be pointing to the universe being created as a function of us being able to see the universe. We know that there's an observer effect. We know that when we observe massless waves, they present themselves as particles for us. And when we're not looking, they return to their wave form. It's just that our brains are interpreting those waves as either solid or not, or moving or not, but it's all just information. Waves is just numerical information like what we've been seeing. Okay, so for whatever crazy reason, these dates associated with Thales so far are all pointing toward the same concept, these electromagnetic fields, these all this stuff that has to do with his name. And remember, I also told you it has to do with our blood. So the dielectric of our blood, the ability to send electricity through that. We have electrolytes in our blood, and the connection between those things tie right back to that Great Pyramid, where I told you it has a Leyden jar, which is basically literally capturing lightning in a bottle, being able to store charge that you build up through static electricity and things of that nature, and being able to release it as a discharge. This central concept it's at the center of so many things. Tesla's work, Ben Franklin with his kite, quote unquote, the Ark of the Covenant, the pyramids, all of this is based on the third ventricle of the human brain. It's based on the exact same design. So the reason they have these effects on consciousness and perception is because these structures were designed with a profound understanding of how our head works and what goes on in it. So when we're talking about letting there be light, when we're talking about creation in the head, we're talking about the earth going through a very similar process to how thoughts form in our head. So we're just living out a simulation of how the actual universe was created. Why? Because we are God experiencing himself itself as a different type of expression. So all of us are God. It's just we're each individual levels, like we're different versions of the same game, and so we come in, we say, okay, well, we're going to set these kind of parameters for this particular soul. A soul is just that same God essence experiencing reality in a specific way. Okay. So we got the beginning, we've got the midpoint, thing that's holding the stuff together, Mind you, the same thing that holds together your cells, your atoms, that same static electricity is what's holding the atmosphere together. So that dichotomy between those two things, that they are one and the same, that extends to our concept of God and the individual soul being the same thing. And oh boy, I'm running behind. I gotta go get my daughter now. But we'll pick up. I think that's enough. So I'll do another part to this, and we'll pick up on the last part of this, and then I'll get into some of the West African initiations. But I'll see you in a minute, y'all. Let me go ahead and say peace to you, and I'll be back.